My name is John Lobell. I teach architecture at Pratt Institute. This is an introductory and overview lecture about Frank Lloyd Wright for my Frank Lloyd Wright course given in fall 2016. Okay, so we might characterize the approach I want to take in this course as twofold. One is how Wright's architecture is reflective of and participates in its culture, and two is how the buildings are put together, and because we're architects. And not only that, how they're put together in order to participate in and reflect its culture. In other words, architecture as philosophy, expressing its philosophical position through buildings rather than through writing. And we'll see that in the essay on Kahn that I have in your course outline, that approach that we can see architecture philosophically. Now, we're going to, starting week after next, look at Wright's buildings each in some detail, but I want to start right off with a quick overview so that if I say Falling Water or Johnson Wax or Usonian houses, that something comes to mind. So we're just going to zip through Wright's life and career, and then we'll be doing it in much more detail throughout the course. So Wright lived from 1867 to 1959, and besides architecture, made contributions to philosophy, literature, education, engineering, interior design, and graphic arts, and we identify him with organic architecture. With what do you associate the year around then, 1867? What happened around then? What are the years? Yeah. So the Civil War ended 1865. So he was born 2 years after the end of the Civil War. That's a long time ago. What happened 2 years after 1959? I mean, it could be anything, but President John F. Kennedy announced we're going to the moon. So that's a pretty culturally and technologically broad span of history that Wright lived through. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but wow. So Wright built mostly in the Midwest. That's where he was born, and then scattered works around the rest of the country. And we're going to sort of go through an outline of Wright's career. So this is going to go too quickly for you to write down, but if you want to get this in your notes, the slides are online. He was born in a farming town in 1867, 2 years after the end of the Civil War. His father was an itinerant preacher and music teacher, never really could get his act together, and Frank Lloyd Wright's mother threw him out when Wright was 14. And so he was very much raised under the influence of his mother, although his father influenced him as well. His mother was a county school teacher. His mother decorated her bedroom with etchings of English cathedrals while she was pregnant. She wanted to get him started early as an architect. So the plan was from the beginning he'd be an architect. He did not finish high school. He did 1 year at the University of Wisconsin. These are what's called Freuble blocks, children's toys of the day, like Lego blocks. And his mother got them for him to influence his spatial thinking, and sure enough, we can see their influence in his work. Wright went to Chicago, which was the big city of the day, and in the area, and eventually went to work for Louis Sullivan. The firm was Adler and Sullivan, and he was project architect on Sullivan's Wainwright building. Wright was fired for the bootleg houses. So Sullivan was very generous, lent him money to get married, build his own house, but Wright was not good with money. He spent it like crazy. He always had expensive clothes, expensive horses, expensive cars, and was always in debt. And so he was doing houses at night on the kitchen table in his neighborhood. You're not supposed to do that. You get a commission, you bring it into the office. So Sullivan fired him. He married Catherine, 1889, is separated 20 years later, and had 6 kids. Wright was constantly short on money, and Wright lived in 3 houses, as we'll see. One in Oak Park, and then Taliesin East and Taliesin West, which we'll look at. Now, Wright had a tumultuous personal life with several women. So Catherine Wright was his wife for 20 years, 6 kids. He left her to run off with Ma Cheney. She was the wife of a client. He was doing a house for them. They fell in love. And it was so scandalous in those days to do that they went off to Europe. And the newspapers were filled with gossip. Wright's wife would not give him a divorce. Eventually, she gets murdered while he's in Chicago by a berserk servant, and he marries Maud Noel, who is mentally unbalanced. They get divorced a few years later, and Olga Ivanovich comes up to Wright and says, "I'm going to marry you and I'm going to take care of you." So she did, and he was married to her for the rest of his life, and she ran the show. Thanks. So that's a tumultuous personal life, but in 1928 he settles down and there's no more tumult. Sort of a view of what this was about. Wright was born into an agrarian world of small farms, art and craft, transcendentalism, which we associate with Ralph Waldo Emerson. So Ralph Waldo Emerson was not a past historical figure for Wright. Wright was 15 years old when Emerson died. In other words, was someone who was alive at his time. He grew up into a world of explosive industrialization: steel, concrete, skyscrapers, telephone, radio, television, automobile, jet travel, atomic energy, and satellites. So who knew that was going to happen from this small town that he grew up in? In 1867, when Wright was born, population of Chicago, which was the big city in the Midwest where he was 150,000. When he moved there, it was 700,000. When he opened his own office, it was $1.9 million. So where have we seen growth like that recently? Dubai. Dubai was a pearl diving coastal town where camel trains came in the 1970s. Today, it's one of the world's major cities, has the busiest airport in the world and the tallest building in the world. Just boom, in 20 years. Yeah.
What year was the World's Fair?
1893.
Okay. Oh, okay, so that's right before this moment. Okay, all right.
Yes, that's the year of the World's Fair. We'll talk about that next week. It becomes very contentious in architectural circles. So these are the Froebel blocks that his mother got him. Now, what the hell's going on out there? If you learn a language up to the age of, 5, 6, 7, it's easy. So you learn your native language, in a few months, just like that. And then if you're a young child and you move to a new country, you pick up the new language in a couple months. I took 2 years of French in high school and 3 years in college, and I can't speak a word of it. In other words, if you study it academically later in life, forget it. If you're a child, the brain picks it up just like that. So the ability of the brain to absorb language shuts down at, 15 years old, whatever. And now you have to study it academically. You don't just pick it up. I'm going to suggest that thinking spatially is similar. If you are playing with blocks at 1, 2, 3 years of age, you start to think spatially. And you absorb spatial thinking as a language. If you start studying architecture when you're 18 years old in first year Pratt, good luck. It's like learning French in French class. It's always a struggle. Frank Lloyd Wright, when he did Falling Water, he did the whole thing in his head. There are no sketches. There are no early versions. He had the whole thing totally designed in his head, and then he just drew it.
It's only doing the same one, right?
Yeah, we'll have a story about that. Right. So, something to think about. That spatial design thinking is something best started in kindergarten. And the kids that grew up with Lego blocks and drawing and whatever are going to have an advantage over the people who majored in English and then go to architecture and graduate school. This is a sketch that Wright did in, can't read it, about 1883 for Louis Sullivan when he was interviewing for a job. So already we're seeing a lot of Wright's ideas. So Wright worked for Sullivan. Sullivan was one of the maybe 4 major firms in Chicago and the most avant-garde one. So the others were like more establishment, got bigger commissions. But Sullivan was really important. This is a Chicago school building. We'll talk about this next week. And it's happens to be in St. Louis. Just want to see what the hell's going on. Isn't architectural education great? Okay, so Wright was the job captain on this building, but we're going to see what Wright thought about it shortly. This is known for Sullivan said there are 5 parts to a modern skyscraper. Basement, first floor, second floor, repeated identical floors, and cornice. So, basement has mechanical equipment, first floor is entrance and public stores, second floor is offices the public go to, like a dentist's office or something. Repeated identical floors are office space, and then elevator machinery and stuff like that go on the roof. So here are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parts. Come around the corner, and it's just a plain brick wall. This aesthetic is stuck, pasted on like a suit of clothes. And Wright said, that's not right. It should grow organically from the inside of the building. And we'll see that momentarily. So Wright did, and scholars have to pour through all the records for this, but said ballpark, 1,100 designs, 500 completed works all over the country. Apparently nothing in North or South Dakota, but mostly concentrated around the Midwest. This is Wright's house for himself and his family for 20 years in Oak Park, a suburb of Chicago. And it's in the shingle style. We're going to see where this comes from. Interior, bedroom, it's kind of enfolding and closing roof or ceiling. This is a children's playroom. It's so cool. So here's where the kids play. Of course, there's a piano because this is before stereos or, mechanical recorded music. Here's their balcony so they can put on plays. And then here is a friend of Wright's does a mural of Aladdin and the Magic Lantern. So it's just a magical place. Had a real sense of family and the house as a place for family. House kept expanding over the years. We were looking at this. Now we're looking here, and this is his office. Here's a house for his mother so she can help with the 6 kids. He moves to, when he comes back, he leaves his wife, runs off to Europe with Ma Chaney. When they come back, he builds on family land Taliesin East. Taliesin is a Welsh poet that he names this after. And it's sprawling into the landscape of Spring Green, Wisconsin. And we'll look at all this in detail as we go. Beautiful rolling landscape, but 6 feet of snow in the winter. So Wright is off in Arizona on a project, and he says, hey, this is a lot better in the winter than Wisconsin. So he buys land and builds Taliesin West. And famously, suburban Scottsdale is encroaching. It was the middle of nowhere. But now the suburbs are encroaching on this compound. And he would commute back and forth. So he'd spend winters here. You don't want to be here in the summer. It's 110 degrees. Winters here, summers in Spring Green, Wisconsin. So, overview of Wright's work. We break this up. Early work. First we have right before Wright. Client wants a Tudor house, the client gets a Tudor house. There's 6 kids to feed. So there are buildings Wright did that if you're really into it, you could say, I see some Wright here. But this is not his mature style. And then it starts to look like Wright. This is the first house on his own after he left Sullivan, and it's got this horizontality. Trick is, this is a 2-story house, but the second story is in shadow to make it look like a one-story house to emphasize its horizontality. The prairie style is Wright's mature work. So, in contrast to Andrea Palladio's Villa Rotunda, which puts the human being in the center, Wright puts the chimney core in the center, and with a kind of pinwheeling pattern around it, so that the human being is continually in motion around this center. Now, this idea of having the mechanical core in the center is also done by Catherine Beecher, 1869, American Woman's Home. And she develops the idea that you should have the mechanical in the center and open, flexible space around it. So, but she doesn't really have an aesthetic. It's kind of a gingerbread cottage. Wright takes that idea and gives it an aesthetic. So here's the Roby house with the stair, mechanical, and chimney in the center, and then the spaces flowing around it, the open plan. Well, there's the living room, and we flow around and through the chimney core to the dining room. This is modern furniture, it's not Wright's furniture. So the traditional house had boxy rooms for predetermined functions. Wright gives an open, flowing plan. And he adopts this from shingle-style houses of Bruce Price. And again, we'll look at that in 2 weeks. So this is Ward Willett House, 1900-1902, the first mature, fully realized expression of Frank Lloyd Wright's prairie style, which is a symmetrical, open plan, one room flowing into another, interpenetration of inside and outside, whole walls of glass, massive chimney core, low-sloped overhanging roofs, horizontality as though it's moving across the prairie. And again, if this is too quick for you to write down, we're going to do a whole week on it in 2 weeks. So. And the most famous example of the prairie style house is the Roby house. Another prairie style house we mentioned is the Susan Dana house, and one of the things we like about it is she just walked off and left it to a foundation. So all the silverware is there, all the bedspreads are there. It's in total original condition. It's a museum, so. It has spectacular stained glass. And rich space for all effects. Another house of that period is the Martin House, which is spread out into the landscape, and we'll go into this in some detail later in the course. This house is of interest to us today because it has been totally restored. So it had been broken up, an apartment building was built here, and in the 1950s, 60s, it was, everyone wanted a new ranch house. What's this stuff? And today we realize the tourist dollar value of having something like this. People will come to your city and spend money if you've got, what's a stupid city in Spain that no one ever heard of that's now super famous? Bilbao. Frank Gehry's Bilbao Museum. Who the hell ever heard of Bilbao? It was a little nothing port town They built this Frank Gehry Museum, and it's now one of the most famous cities in the world. That's, oh my God, architecture can do that. That's cool. He does a few institutional buildings. This is the Unity Temple, a church, and pioneers the use of poured-in-place concrete, very geometric, and the inside we have this kind of very rectilinear geometric forms, and he uses slip forming. So this is, and he did it because it saved money. It was a very tight budget. But this piece of formwork here, the concrete in there is setting right now. Previously, this piece was down here, and then you slip it up, pour more concrete. So we can do that in a very sophisticated way today, but it's pioneering use of slip form concrete. 1920s, he does concrete tile houses. So these are prefabricated concrete blocks or tiles assembled with rebars. So here are the tiles. We do a double wall, airspace in between. That's our masonry wall. And there are these sort of hollows on each side. So we put two together, you get a circle. We fill that with grout and put a 1/4-inch rebar in there. This is the Innes House, very famous. We'll talk more about that. In the 20s, teens and 20s, he does Taliesin, which is a compound for himself. Now, eventually, in the 30s, he has no work. It's this 10-year period when he doesn't have any commissions. And he says, no, I'd sort of like to pass on what I've learned. He doesn't like the idea of school, so he calls it an apprenticeship. And you could go there, pay a nominal tuition, work on farming, building, gardening, and when he did get work on the projects. And there are architects around to this day. That was how they went to school. Less and less, because it was a long time ago. So it was a big operation, his home. So he falls into obscurity, no one's heard, everybody thinks he's dead, and then he does Fall in Water. So Kaufman, a department store owner in Pittsburgh, his son is one of the apprentices at Taliesin. They have a land outside of Pittsburgh where they picnic. And it's time to build a weekend house, and Kaufman's Jr. says, "Hey, Dad, why don't we get Frank Lloyd Wright to do the house?" Well, went a little bit over budget, but it sort of it was worth it. Kaufman got on the cover of Time magazine, so that ain't bad. I have this slide in here because Wright is interested in the continuity of flow from inside to outside. So these are mullions. There's glass here, and the glass butts into the stone wall. Now it would be much better if he put a metal mullion here for the glass to meet. Instead, the glass goes right into the stone, which is, kind of a brittle situation. The reason he does that is for this visual effect. Inside and outside flow together, one of the Wright's themes. And something I'll go into some detail, but in the 1920s, Europeans who were influenced, this is slipping my mind. Europeans who were influenced by Wright start building this very rectilinear architecture, and the thought is Wright influenced these people, and then these people influenced Wright. Wright says, yeah, how come I was already doing it in 1909? So everything you see, this element here, the vertical, 1, 2 balconies in the roof, 1, 2 balconies in the roof, is all here in the Gale House, 1909. This is 1936. Same time he does Johnson Wax headquarters. And modern architecture is supposed to be for the common person, supposed to make housing more economical, and all the famous architects are building very expensive houses for rich people. Well, the reason for that is that the people who go to architects are rich people. People, in the suburbs don't say, well, instead of buying this little boxy suburban house, why don't we get, a recent Pratt grad to do us something really wild and crazy? Middle-class people don't usually do wild and crazy. Rich people do wild and crazy and get a house by Frank Gehry. So, but modern architecture really does aspire to make our good homes affordable, which we see in the Corbusier's, Villedieu's, and then Citroën houses, etc. And so Frank Lloyd Wright does the Usonian houses, very economical. So this is first Jacob's house, and built, they say, for $5,500. So these are the Usonian houses. He works on city planning. And in the 1950s, does some interesting projects, the Price Tower, an Orthodox church. This is a project for a home and club for 100 in Hartford, and the Guggenheim Museum. And the Guggenheim Museum had earlier manifestations. This is 1925, a planetarium with a spiral road around it. And Wright did graphics. These magazine covers. These are dishes from the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. Lots of interior design. This is a dress for Mrs. Martin at the Martin House. This is some Wright stained glass. This is a Mondrian painting. You can see Mondrian and the other De Stijl artists were influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright. Here's some other magazine covers. Oops, sorry about that. So, span of Wright's life. Mentioned this at the beginning. Wright was born in 1867. The Civil War ended in 1865. So Wright was born right after the end of the Civil War. 1959, Wright was flying in 707 jet planes. There was atomic energy. So here is Wright's first house on his own, 1894. Winslow House. You drive into the stables. You drive in with your horse. Right here is a little cast iron Scotty dog he used to scrape the horse manure off your boots, because the whole city was knee deep in this stuff. This is one of Wright's last projects, 1956, proposal for a mile-high tower with atomic-powered elevators. So from horsepower to atomic power, that's the technological span that Wright lived through. So,